She flies an air taxi, my mother said, laughing into her champagne. That's how she introduced me to the head table at my brother's award gala, in front of 200 donors in a hotel ballroom in downtown Nashville. My brother didn't even wait for the laugh to die. He leaned into his microphone and said, "Let's be honest, Delaney's never even been shot at." And then the keynote speaker set down her water glass. She was a two-star general in the United States Army, and 14 months earlier she had been the voice in my headset at 2 in the morning telling me the weather was too bad to fly and that she wouldn't blame me if I said no. She stood up in the middle of my brother's toast. She looked past him, straight down the table at me, and she asked me one question, 9 words long, and my mother's face went the color of dishwater. Before I tell you what those 9 words were, do me a favor, friend. Tap that like button. Subscribe, especially if your own people have ever made you small at a dinner table just because your life didn't photograph well. Tell me in the comments what state you're watching from, because I have a feeling this story is going to feel personal to a lot of you. But to understand why 9 words could gut a woman in a $400 dress, I have to take you back 7 years, to the summer my family decided I was a lost cause. I grew up in Franklin, Tennessee, in a brick house with white columns that my mother made sure looked older and richer than it was. Delaney Ward sold luxury real estate. She had her face on bus benches and shopping carts, and she had spent 20 years clawing her way toward a membership at the Harpeth Hills Country Club that we could not actually afford. My father, Glenn, was the athletic director at the high school. He had been a decent quarterback in 1983 and had been passed over for a college scholarship by one phone call that never came, and he had never once recovered from it. He wore the same navy blazer to every event for 11 years. And when my mother got wound up, when her voice climbed and her hands started shaking with that particular rage that only comes from a woman who is terrified of being found out, my father had a routine. He'd put both hands in his pockets. He'd study the grout lines in the kitchen tile like they held the answer. He'd make a small sound in his throat, sort of a hum, and then he'd go check on the sprinklers. Every single time, he called it not adding fuel. What it actually was a message he delivered to me every day of my childhood without ever opening his mouth. You are not worth the fight. The living room of that house was not a living room. It was a display case, and everything in it belonged to my brother. Colton is 3 years older than me. He smelled like drugstore cologne and unearned confidence, and at 31, he ran a nonprofit called Semper Forward that he had built out of other people's service. He interviewed veterans on a podcast. He posted their photographs with long captions about sacrifice. He wore a bracelet with a stranger's name on it, a kid from Clarksville who died in Helmand, and he could not tell you that kid's rank. He'd never worn a uniform in his life. Not JROTC, not a day. But he'd figured out that grief sells, and my mother built her entire identity on him. Framed magazine spreads, a plaque from the Chamber of Commerce, a photo of him shaking hands with a congressman hung dead center over the fireplace like a crucifix. I was the other one. I was the daughter she introduced with a sigh. When guests came over, and they always did, other Franklin couples pretending to be old money the same way we were, my mother ran a script so reliable I could have recited it with her. She'd tap her ring against her glass. She'd announce that Colton's foundation had cleared $100,000 in donations that quarter, and the table would make that warm noise people make. Then she'd pause. Then her eyes would find me at the end of the table, and every ounce of pride would drain out of her face and get replaced with this cheap, wet-looking pity. And Delaney, she'd say. Well, Delaney's still doing her thing out at the base. Some kind of medical transport. She's always been the practical one. Colton would smirk into his napkin. My father would develop a sudden fascination with the green beans. And the guests would give me the nod. You know the nod. The tight-lipped, sorry about your life nod that people give the family disappointment. Here's the thing about a house like that, friend. You don't scream in it. Screaming is what they want, because screaming makes you the problem. You learn to go quiet and watch. You learn where every fault line is. By the time I was 17, I could read my mother's mood by which cabinet she shut first when she came in the door. I tried to fight once, when I was 19. I made the mistake of telling the truth at Sunday dinner. I told them I had joined Army ROTC at Tennessee, that I was already a year in, that I'd been getting up at 4:45 3 days a week for 2 semesters and nobody had noticed. My mother put down her fork very calmly. She said, "That's a hobby, not a plan." 2 weeks later, my car was gone. The little silver Corolla I'd bought with 3 summers of hostess money at a steakhouse on Cool Springs Boulevard, the title in her name because I'd been 17 when we bought it. She gave it to Colton for his birthday. She said I clearly had a lot on my plate and didn't need the distraction. She also cleaned out what was left of the education account my grandfather had opened for me. Every dollar of it went into Colton's first fundraising gala. I never mentioned ROTC in that house again. For 3 years, I kept my uniform in a duffel bag in the trunk of a car I didn't own anymore, then in a friend's garage, and I told myself that silence wasn't surrender. It was just terrain I hadn't taken yet. The break came the August I turned 21. I'd graduated a semester early, honors, biology, and I had 2 envelopes on the kitchen counter. One was an acceptance letter to Vanderbilt Law, which I had applied to in a moment of weakness, half to see if I could, half because some starved little part of me still wanted her to look at me the way she looked at that fireplace. The other envelope was my commissioning packet and my orders. Aviation branch, Fort Novosel, Alabama. Flight school. The kitchen was 91 degrees that day because my mother wouldn't run the air past 76 with guests coming. I remember the ice maker dropping a load into the tray, that loud tumbling clatter, and then absolute silence. My mother picked up the wrong envelope first. I watched her face open up, watched 20 years of hunger flash across it, and then I said, I'm not going to law school. I'm going to flight school. I'm going to fly medevac. She didn't yell right away. That's the part people get wrong about women like my mother. First, she got very still, and she smiled at me, and she said, Do you have any idea what you look like right now? Then it came. She said I was going to spend my life as a glorified bus driver for bleeding strangers. She said I was throwing away the only thing this family had ever managed to build, which was a name in this town, and for what? So I could sweat in a flight suit in some country nobody's ever heard of. My father came in from the garage in his flip-flops. He looked at the orders on the counter and he groaned into his hands. And do you know what the first words out of my father's mouth were? He said, Del, I already told the boosters you got into Vanderbilt. Not are you sure, not will you be safe. Just the boosters. Just what the men at the field house would say on Monday. My phone lit up on the counter. Colton, texting me from his bedroom 40 feet away. It said, You always have to make everything about you. Mom's crying. Just take the win and go to law school. And my mother delivered the sentence she'd been saving, pointing one acrylic nail an inch from my face. If you walk out that door in that direction, she said, you are on your own for good. Not a dollar, not a phone call. Not a room at Christmas. You will be nobody, and you will have done it to yourself. I stood up. I pushed the chair in because she hated when we didn't. I walked out the back screen door into that thick Tennessee evening that smells like cut grass and hot asphalt cooling down, and there was one person in that entire bloodline sitting on the steps waiting for me. My grandfather. Everybody called him Pap. Ellis Ward, 82 years old, 5'6", hands like tree bark. He'd spent 26 years in the Merchant Marine, hauling ammunition and fuel across 2 oceans for the Military Sealift Command, including a stretch off Vietnam in 1966 that he'd told me exactly one story about, and never again. He didn't ask if I was sure. He reached into the pocket of his windbreaker and pressed a coffee can lid full of folded bills into my hand. $940, mostly 20s, some of them soft as cloth. Then he put something else on top of it. A brass boatswain's pipe on a black lanyard, dented, tarnished dark, the chain worn shiny where a thumb had rubbed it for decades. He said, That thing was in my pocket the night we took on water 200 miles from anywhere. You keep it. When it gets loud and dark and you can't hear yourself think, you put your hand on it and you remember which side of the family you actually come from. Then he said one more thing, and I want you to hear it, friend, because it took me 7 years to understand it. He said, Every family like ours picks a golden one and picks a burden. It's got nothing to do with which one of you is worth a damn. The burden's the one that grows up strong. Don't waste your life waiting on them to notice. I put the lanyard around my neck. I didn't go back inside to say goodbye. I threw a duffel in the bed of Pap's 1998 F-150, and he drove me to the Greyhound station on Charlotte Pike himself, and neither of us said a word the whole way. And when I got out, he squeezed my forearm twice and drove off before I could see his face. Flight school will take everything you have and then ask what else you brought. 200 hours in a Lakota and then a Black Hawk that weighs 11 tons and wants very badly to kill you every single day. I finished, and I got my wings, and I got sent to a medevac company, and I found out what I actually was. I'm going to tell you about a ridge. The crews called it Hollow Ridge, and it sits in a country the news never bothered to name, and 14 months before that gala, I flew into it at 0230 in weather that had grounded everything else on the base. 2 casualties on the ground, an infantry patrol that got hit and then got hit again, one of them with a leg gone below the knee, and a tourniquet that wasn't holding, no place to land. 9,000 feet of rock, and a wind coming down that valley like a freight train, and dust and snow together in the rotor wash so thick that when I looked out my chin bubble, I could not see my own landing gear. My crew chief was Staff Sergeant Bo Whitaker, 34 years old, from a town in Michigan with 1 traffic light, 2 little girls and a wife who sent us all beef jerky at Christmas. Bo rode the hoist down into that mess 3 separate times. 3rd trip up, with the litter swinging and me holding a hover on instruments and prayer, somebody on that ridgeline opened up on us. I heard it come through the airframe. Not a bang, a sound like a hammer hitting a filing cabinet, 3 times fast. Bo took a round through the meat of his shoulder, and the shockwave threw him into the doorframe hard enough to break 2 vertebrae in his back, and he did not let go of that hoist cable. He got the kid inside. That kid's name is Danny Cobb. He was 22 years old. He's from Corbin, Kentucky, and he is alive today with a prosthetic and a baby daughter. I flew them out of there. I don't remember most of it. I remember the master caution light, and Bo screaming at me through the intercom to go, just go. And I remember setting down on the pad at the surgical hospital, and my hands shaking so hard on the collective that I had to sit on them. I spent that night and the next day in that same hospital because I had a piece of the airframe in my right calf that I hadn't noticed for 40 minutes. And on the second morning, sitting up in a cot with my leg wrapped, floating a little on whatever they'd given me, I did something stupid. It was my 27th birthday. I called home. My mother picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear the television, one of those morning shows, and the specific rattle of ice in a glass at 10 in the morning her time. She said hello like I was a solicitor. I said, "Hey, it's me." And she said, "Well, are you done playing helicopter yet? Or is that still a thing we're doing?" I said, "Mom, I got hurt. I'm okay, but I got hurt. I wanted to tell you before somebody else did." There was a pause. Not a worried pause. A busy one. Then she said, "Delaney, your brother is on Channel 4 on Thursday. The whole segment. Do you know what that does for us?" My father got on the line. I could picture him hovering, wanting so badly to agree with her. He said, "Del, listen, your brother's foundation cleared $250,000 this year. He's the one actually taking care of these boys. You should see the letters he gets. He's the one actually taking care of these boys." Friend, I want you to picture where I was standing while my father said that. 20 feet down the hall from me was Bo Whitaker, 34 years old, face down in a rotating bed with a titanium rod being put into his spine because he had refused to let go of a cable while people shot at him. Danny Cobb was 2 rooms over, learning that his leg ended at the knee now. And my father was telling me that the man taking care of these boys was a guy in Franklin, Tennessee, with a podcast microphone and a bracelet with a dead kid's name on it that he couldn't pronounce. I didn't yell. I want you to know that. There is a kind of anger that arrives cold, and that's the kind I got. It came up through my chest, and it went out through my fingertips, and when it was gone, so was something else. That last stupid ember, the one I'd been keeping alive since I was 9 years old, the one that said maybe someday she'll look at me the way she looks at him, it went out. I said, "Okay, Dad," and I pressed the red button, and I set the phone face down on the cot, and I did not call that house again. 14 months went by. Here's who I am now. I'm Captain Delaney Ward, 28 years old, medevac pilot and instructor pilot at Fort Campbell, which sits on the Kentucky-Tennessee line about an hour and 10 minutes from the driveway I grew up in. My apartment in Clarksville has almost nothing in it. A couch, a good coffee maker, a bookshelf of aviation regs, and a scar on my right calf that itches when it's about to rain. 14 months ago, they gave me the Distinguished Flying Cross for what happened on Hollow Ridge. There was a ceremony, there was a citation, and the citation was published in the Army Times and in the Fort Campbell Courier, and it ran in the Nashville paper on a Sunday in the section about local service members. It had my name in it, my full name. It was public. Anyone could have read it. Nobody in that brick house with the white columns ever did. So when Colton called me on a Tuesday in April, I almost let it ring out. He didn't say hello. He said, "So I'm getting an award." He talked for 11 minutes. Sloane Ferris, his fiancée, a real estate attorney whose father chaired the hospital foundation. The gala at the Grand Hermitage downtown, black tie, 400 a plate. Advocate for Veterans of the Year. Presented by the Harpeth Valley Hospital Foundation. And then he said the thing that made me set down the coffee pot I was holding. And listen, the keynote's a big deal. 2-star, Army, Barrow, something Barrow, Major General Eloise Barrow. 14 months ago, Major General Barrow had been a 1-star colonel turned brigadier running the ground element that got hit on Hollow Ridge. She was the voice that came up on my frequency at 0217 and told me, in that flat, careful way commanders talk when they're trying not to order somebody to die, that the ceiling was below minimums, that she had 2 urgent surgicals, and that nobody would think less of me if I said no. I said, "Ma'am, I'm turning now." She's the one who wrote me up for the award. I had stood in front of her twice in my life, both times at attention, both times for less than 4 minutes. My brother had no idea. He was blissfully, gorgeously ignorant, setting a bomb on his own table and inviting me to watch. "Mom wants you there," he said. "Just, dress like an adult, and don't make it weird." I got there 20 minutes early. I wore a plain black dress, no jewelry except the brass pipe on its lanyard, tucked underneath where nobody could see it. No uniform, no pin. I don't wear my life on the outside. The check-in table had a seating chart in a gold frame. I found our table. Ward, Marianne. Ward, Glenn. Ward, Colton. And beside it, Ferris, Sloane. And then, at the last seat, a card that read, "Guest of Colton Ward." Not my name. My name was not on it. I stood there, in that hotel lobby, with a string quartet, sawing away behind me, and I understood that somebody had looked at a list, seen my name, and made a decision. And then, at the table, Colton's phone lit up face up on the linen while he was off working the room. A text from my mother, 4 feet from my hand, glowing in a group chat named Team Colton, with 3 people in it. My mother. My father, my brother, not me, never me. It said, "Do not let Dee bring up the Army tonight. The general is speaking and Colton needs the room clean. If anyone asks, just say healthcare. Say healthcare." I didn't touch the phone. I picked up my water glass and I felt the anger arrive, and it was that cold kind again, the useful kind. Because here's what that text meant. It wasn't thoughtlessness. It wasn't ignorance. It was a plan. They had gotten together, the 3 of them, and made a coordinated decision to erase me for a night, because the truth about me was inconvenient to the story they were selling. The ridge, the scar, the citation, the dented brass pipe under my collar, all of it was a stain on the brochure. I put the glass down. I rolled my shoulders back, and the scar tissue pulled the way it does. And I thought about what my instructor pilot used to say. You don't fight the aircraft. You let it tell you what it's doing, and then you use it. They had no idea who was about to walk through those ballroom doors. Dinner started. My mother held court. She wore navy silk from Dillard's that she'd tell everyone was from somewhere else, and she worked that table like a woman who had been rehearsing her whole life for a room exactly this size. Sloane's father, Dr. Everett Ferris, sat across from me. He was a genuinely decent man, silver-haired, a little bored, and midway through the salad course, he leaned toward me and said, "Now, Delaney, Colton talks about the foundation nonstop. What is it you do?" I opened my mouth. I got out 1 syllable. "Oh, Delaney's out at Campbell," my mother said, sliding right over the top of me. "She does the medical transport side of things. Flies the air ambulance." She waved her hand like she was moving a fly off a plate. "It's very safe. She's always been the cautious one." And my brother, God bless him, could not help himself. He was 17 minutes from the podium, and he wanted the Ferrises to know there was exactly one Ward who understood sacrifice. He set his wine down and he said, loud enough to reach the next table, "Let's be honest, Dell's never even been shot at. She's basically an air taxi driver with a stethoscope. The guys I work with, the real ones, they've been through things she can't imagine." I looked at my father. He was sitting right next to him. And Glenn Ward, 61 years old, athletic director, quarterback in 1983, looked down at his plate and made that small humming sound in his throat and said nothing at all. Under the tablecloth, a hand clamped down on my wrist. Pap, 82 years old, in a suit from 1991, sitting to my left with his jaw set so hard I could see the muscle jumping. He was shaking. Not from age. I put my other hand over his and squeezed once. Stand down, old man. Not yet. And that's when the ballroom doors opened at the back, and a woman in army blues walked in with a 2-star on each shoulder. If you have ever had to sit still and eat while somebody who has never done the work took credit for it in front of a room, hit that like button for me right now. Drop a comment that just says, I've been at that table. I want to see how many of us there are. Major General Eloise Barrow was not a large woman. It didn't matter. The temperature of that room dropped about 5 degrees when she came in. My mother's laugh stopped in the middle of itself. Everyone stood up, the way people do without knowing why. Colton knocked his knee into the table, getting out of his chair, and spilled red wine across the linen in a spreading blot. The general shook hands down the line. Dr. Ferris. Sloane. My father, who wiped his palm on his trousers first. My mother, who held on 2 seconds too long. And then she got to my end of the table and she stopped walking. I stood at attention, without deciding to. 7 years of muscle memory. I watched it happen behind her eyes. The flicker. The recalculation. Then she said, Captain Ward. Not loudly, she didn't have to. My mother made a sound like a hiccup. Colton's hand, extended toward the general, dropped slowly back to his side. Captain. In that family, the word was a foreign language. Ma'am, I said. I didn't expect to see you tonight, the general said. Whose table is this? My brother's, ma'am. He's receiving the award. She turned her head about 15 degrees and looked at Colton for exactly as long as it takes to identify something. Then she said, I see. And she sat down, and she smoothed her jacket, and she said, Please, continue your dinner. Nobody continued anything. My mother, drowning, reached for the only float she knew. She laughed, high and thin, and said, General, we were just talking about Colton's foundation. He's done such wonderful work for our veterans. Major General Barrow did not look at my mother. She said, quietly, to nobody, I've found there's usually a difference between the people who work for soldiers and the people who work on them. Then they called my brother to the podium. He gave a good speech, I'll say that. He talked about the debt this country owes. He talked about a young man from Clarksville whose name was on his wrist. He talked about the ones who go into the dark so the rest of us can sleep. And my mother sat with her hand pressed flat against her collarbone, glowing like a woman at her own coronation. And at the end, he raised his glass toward our table, and he said, And to my family, who taught me what service really means. And Major General Eloise Barrow stood up. 400 people watched a 2-star general get out of her chair while a civilian was toasting himself. She walked to the podium. She did not hurry. Colton stepped back from the microphone with a confused little grin, thinking, I am certain that he was about to be blessed. She adjusted the mic down about 2 inches. She said, Forgive me. Before I give my remarks, I need to correct the record in this room because I don't have it in me to sit here and let it stand. And then she looked out past the lights, right at our table, and she asked her 9 words. Captain Ward, would you tell them about Hollow Ridge? My mother's face drained so fast I watched her go gray in real time. Her mouth opened. She said, Oh, General, Delaney just does transport. She wasn't. Ma'am. Barrow didn't raise her voice. She didn't need a microphone for that part. I am speaking to my officer. My mother's jaw shut so hard I heard her teeth click. I stood up at my seat. I said, I'd rather you tell it, ma'am. That's what I thought. She reached into her jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. And here's the part I want you to understand, friend. The part that still puts a hole in my chest. It wasn't classified. It wasn't secret. It was a photocopy of a newspaper page. 14 months ago, she said, in a place I'm not going to name, I had 2 soldiers on a ridgeline at 9,000 feet, with weather below minimums and enemy on the high ground. Every aircraft in the theater was down. Captain Delaney Ward launched anyway. She held a hover in 0 visibility for 19 minutes while her crew ran the hoist under fire. She flew out with 2 urgent surgical patients and a wounded crew chief and 41 holes in her airframe. Both of those patients are alive. One of them is named Danny Cobb, and he sent me a picture of his daughter last Tuesday. She held up the photocopy. The president awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross. This ran in the Nashville paper. Page 11, Section B, 14 months ago. She let that sit for a second. It has been available at every grocery store in this county for over a year. 400 people were not breathing. She turned her head toward my brother, who was still standing 3 feet away holding a crystal award with his own name engraved on it, and she said, "Son, I've read your website. It's very moving. But there is not one line of it that cost you anything. The woman you just described as an air taxi driver is the reason 2 families in Kentucky and Ohio still have somebody at the table. You will not do that again in my presence." Colton's award slipped. He caught it against his stomach with both hands like a man catching something falling off a shelf. His face just came apart. Every bit of that easy, greasy confidence went out of it at once. And what was underneath was a scared 31-year-old who had just realized the entire room could see him. Dr. Everett Ferris stood up at our table. He was not a dramatic man. He looked at my father and he said, in a voice like a door closing, "Glenn, you've had a decorated combat pilot sitting at your dinner table for a year, and you let your son say that about her in front of my family." My father tugged at his collar. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out but air. And my mother, who has never in her life met a fire she couldn't try to swim in, put her hand to her chest and started to cry. Perfect timing, perfect quiver. "Everett, please, we had no idea. She never tells us anything. She shuts us out completely. If I had known my daughter was in danger." The table jumped. My grandfather had brought his fist down on it hard enough to knock over 2 water glasses. Pap stood up, 82 years old, both hands flat on the linen, his whole body shaking, and his voice came out like a chain being dragged across concrete. "You knew." The room flinched. "Don't you sit in front of these people and lie, Marianne. I was standing in your kitchen when that girl called you from a hospital bed with her leg wrapped, and you asked her if she was done playing helicopter. I heard it. You put it on speaker so Glenn could hear the good part about Colton." His finger came up, crooked, dead steady. "You didn't miss it. You chose it. Because a girl in a flight suit doesn't get you into that club, and a boy with a microphone does. You've been trading her in for 30 years and you thought nobody was keeping the receipts." My mother's face changed then. The whole careful architecture of it came down, and what was underneath was ugly and small and furious. She shoved her chair back so hard it screeched, grabbed my forearm with her nails, and hissed, "Outside, now." I let her pull me. Not because she could have moved me, friend, because I wanted a room with a door. The corridor outside the ballroom was cold and dim, all polished stone and hotel carpet. Colton came scrambling after us, desperate to get out from under the lights. The doors clicked shut and cut the noise down to nothing. My mother spun around. She was panting. "Are you satisfied?" she said. "You did this on purpose. You waited 7 years and you set your own brother up in front of 200 donors. Do you have any idea what you've cost this family tonight? I want you to catch what just happened, because if you've lived it, you already know the shape of it." In under 60 seconds, I went from the daughter she erased to the villain who ruined her evening. That's the whole trick. Deny, attack, and then flip who the victim is. I'm the one who took shrapnel out of a helicopter floor, and somehow she was the one bleeding on the hotel carpet. I looked past her. My brother was pressed up against the wall with his tie loose, and he was crying. Not fake crying. The real, hitching, snot and noise kind. The sound a man makes the first time the story he tells about himself falls all the way through. I took 1 step toward my mother. Just one. She backed up until her shoulder blades hit the stone. I didn't yell. I have never once yelled at that woman. I said, "I didn't ruin Colton. You did. You raised a man who thinks a bracelet is the same as a scar, and then you put him on a stage in front of a general. That's not my doing. That's just the bill coming due." She swallowed. And for the first time in 28 years, my mother looked at me and was afraid, because the girl she'd built out of silence had turned out to be load-bearing steel. Then I turned to my brother. He flinched like I'd raised my hand. "Colton," I said, "you wanted to know what it's like to get shot at." I let it sit. "Congratulations. You just had your first one. It doesn't feel like the podcast, does it?" I walked back into that ballroom. 400 faces turned. I didn't go to my seat. I stood at the head of our table and I said, loud enough to carry, "I love my family. I'll probably never stop. But I'm not going to sit at a table where the uniform is an embarrassment. and I'm not going to break bread with people who make a joke out of the men and women I've carried. My mother came through the doors behind me, hair loose, reaching for my shoulder. You can't just leave. I'm your mother. You owe me. And Pap said, Sit down, Marianne. He didn't shout it. She sat down. I walked over to him, and I got down on one knee beside his chair, the way you do. I reached under my collar and pulled the lanyard over my head. That dented brass pipe he'd pressed into my hand on the back steps when I was 21 years old, and I put it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. You gave me this to get through the dark, I said. I'm out of the dark, Pap. I don't need to carry it anymore. And I'm not leaving you in this house another night. He looked at me and his chin went, and he said, Get my coat, sugar. I took my grandfather's arm, and we walked out of the Grand Hermitage together, past 400 people, past a 2-star general who came to attention and held it until we cleared the doors. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my father, still staring at his plate. On the way out, Major General Barrow pressed something into my hand without a word, her command coin. I put Pap in the truck and I drove us out of the city, and I didn't turn the radio on. 22 miles out, I pulled into a boat ramp on the Cumberland River, the way he used to take me when I was little to watch the barges push up river at night. He handed me a piece of paper he'd folded 4 times, written in that shaky old cursive. It said, You quit waiting on them a long time ago, Del. You just forgot to tell yourself. Everybody worth impressing already knows exactly what you are. And friend, that's where the wall came down. I put my forehead on the steering wheel and I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. 7 years of it. I cried for the 21-year-old on that Greyhound, with $940 in a coffee can lid. I cried for Bo Whitaker, who is walking again, mostly, with a cane. I cried for Danny Cobb's leg. I cried for the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of trying to prove myself to people who had already decided, before I could talk, what I was going to be. And I want to say this to somebody out there who needs it. Crying in the dark by yourself after 10 years of somebody grinding you down does not make you weak. It's not a breakdown. It's decompression. You cannot hold your breath forever. Anybody who's ever come off a hard shift knows exactly what I mean. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just put that leathery hand on the back of my neck until I was done. It took about 48 hours for a glass house to come down. Franklin runs on gossip the way an engine runs on oil. By Monday, 2 of Semper Forward's corporate sponsors had pulled out. By Wednesday, 3 board members resigned, and a reporter started asking why the foundation's program spending was under 19%. Sloane Ferris gave the ring back in the parking lot of a Publix. My mother's phone stopped ringing altogether, and I'm told she withdrew her club application before they could do it for her. My father sent 9 text messages. Long ones. I should have said something, Del. I'm your dad. Please call me. Let's just get everybody in a room. I read them all and deleted the thread. 10 years too late is still too late, and I've learned that a man who only finds his voice after the crowd turns never actually had one. Colton left 4 voicemails. On the last one, he was sobbing, saying he was losing everything, saying, would I please just call the general, just tell her I forgave him, just fix it. I stared at that screen for a long time, and I thought about how he built every good thing he ever had by standing on people who couldn't afford to argue with him. Then I blocked all 3 of them. 3 taps on a piece of glass. That's all it took to set down something I'd been dragging since I was 6 years old. Pap's got a 1-bedroom now, 12 minutes from my place in Clarksville, with a window that catches the afternoon light and that brass pipe hanging on a nail by the door. I take him to breakfast on Sundays. He's teaching the guys in my platoon to play cribbage, and he cheats. I drove down to Michigan in June and put Major General Barrow's coin in Bo Whitaker's hand at his kitchen table, because he's the one who never let go of the cable, and I told him the general said so herself. His oldest girl asked me if I'd really flown in a blizzard, and I said, no, sweetheart, your daddy did the hard part. I just held the door open. Last month I got orders. I'm headed to Fort Novosel as a standardization instructor pilot, teaching hoist operations in degraded visual environments to the next crop of medevac crews, which means every kid who comes through that program for the next 3 years is going to learn how to do what we did on Hollow Ridge because a general who was on the ground that night decided the Army needed it taught. My brother stood in a ballroom and told 200 people I'd never been shot at. He was wrong about that, and he was wrong about something bigger. I fought a war for 28 years inside a brick house with white columns against people who shared my blood and would not say my name out loud. And I walked off that battlefield with my grandfather on my arm and my head up. I've got the medal in a drawer somewhere. I've never once needed to take it out. So, let me ask you something, friend, and I want a real answer. Have you ever bled for people who treated you like furniture? Have you ever given somebody your time, your money, your whole self, and still ended up as the family disappointment in their story? Then hear me. You are not alone, and you are not crazy, and the quiet you've been keeping is not weakness. It's altitude. It's you gaining the height you need before you turn. Hit that like button, subscribe so we can keep building this thing with people who actually understand. And do me one favor, drop a comment below that just says, I flew my own mission. Let somebody else scrolling past at 2 in the morning know they're not the only one. Don't you dare wait for the wrong people to see you. The right ones already have.